Welcome, friends. We're glad you've chosen this day to take some time from your busy schedule and study with us from a most important book, the book we call the Bible. We're studying in this series different incidences and events and sayings from the gospel that was written by John the Apostle. And our lesson is taken today from the second chapter. Early in the chapter, the first miracle that Jesus wrought is recorded. It was Jesus turning water to wine. This occurred at Cana of Galilee. But then Jesus returned to Jerusalem and formally began his personal ministry, although he had been calling and selecting apostles. This was that showed his entering into his ministry. Jesus went into the temple, and he found his temple filled with all kinds of things that had to do with business, selling of lambs, and the matter of exchange of money. And he took a scourge, and he drove out all those that were sellers of these animals and these birds, and turned over the money changer's table, said, "Take these cents hence. Make not my Father's house a house of merchandise." Now, there are two times in which Jesus cleansed the temple. One at the beginning of his ministry, and two about 3 years later when he concluded his ministry. But John is the only one that records this at the beginning of his ministry, and therefore some confuse this one with that recorded by Matthew, Mark, and John, and Luke, rather. But we find that in this incident, the sole incident that's recorded, Jesus is asked by his nation for a sign. For they saw the things he did. They were disturbed by his doing what he did. And they said to him, "Give us a sign, seeing you do these things." Well, Jesus did give them a sign. It was a sign that became a sign to his nation, a sign that still persists today, a sign to you, a sign to me. That sign was, "Destroy this temple. In 3 days I will raise it up again." Now, those that were listening to Jesus misunderstood him. They thought that he was talking about the physical temple, and that temple had been building for more than 45 years. 46 years it's been in building, said these. "And you're going to build it in 3 days?" But Jesus wasn't talking about a physical temple. He was talking about the temple of his body. He was predicting his death by them and his resurrection. While Jesus gave this sign, their question was something that was a very common one. When the Apostle Paul wrote to the Corinthians, he said in the first chapter, "Seeing that the Jews seek after signs, and the Greeks after wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified. To the Jews, a stumbling block, and to the Greeks, foolishness, but to those that believe, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God." This was a sign. It was a sign to the Jew, and they sought for signs. On another occasion, early in Jesus' ministry, Jesus had turned the water to wine. Then, further on, he fed 5,000 individuals with just a few loaves and fishes. And they followed him across the sea. And Jesus asked them, "You don't seek me because you saw the signs, but you seek me because you ate of the loaves and were filled." These individuals were ones that sought for a sign. And the sign that Jesus gave to them was that you destroy this body. 3 days. I'm going to raise it up again. Jesus gave this same sign to his nation, but just under a different form, a number of other times in his personal ministry. When individuals asked for a sign, on one occasion he said, "A wicked and adulterous generation seeketh after signs, and there shall be no sign given to him, but the sign of Jonah. For as Jonah was in the belly of the great fish for 3 days and nights, so shall the Son of Man be in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights." Unlike this one that is found in John, the 2nd chapter, Jesus says, "Destroy this temple." Its record was only once, but the sign that Jesus gave of Jonah was repeated several times. But both these have reference to one thing, and Jesus' prediction was this: kill this body, destroy it, crucify it, and in 3 days I am going to raise it up again. Jesus was rejected by his nation just as Isaiah had predicted. Isaiah 53, he was despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. He was rejected by his nation. And his rejection, they put him on a mock trial. And in that mock trial, among other accusations that they brought against him, was this accusation. He said, "Destroy this temple. 3 days I'll raise it up again." Now that would certainly not be something that would be worth crucifying a man for, even if Jesus had predicted that he would tear down that temple in Jerusalem and build it again in 3 days. But while that was a false witness and a false prediction of what Jesus had said, still, there were some that did understand what he was talking about. For when the Jews had been successful in seeing Jesus crucified and dead and buried, they went to Pilate and said, "Sir, we remember that one who was a false teacher predicted that he'd be raised after 3 days. We asked then for a guard, that you might guard his tomb and keep and prevent his disciples from coming by night and stealing his body and saying he's risen." And the last error made first worse than the first. And Pilate gave them that guard. Of course, Matthew records on the resurrection morning, that guard was of no value. It was not Jesus' disciples that came and took his body, but the Father and he joined together in restoring life to that lifeless body in which Jesus had resided, and raised him up. And a great earthquake had occurred. Angels rolled the stone away from the tomb, and those that were watchers were like dead men. They could not prevent Jesus from being raised from the dead. Jesus gave that sign, and Jesus fulfilled that sign. He proved to his disciples that he had been raised from the dead. He ate with them. He allowed them to touch him. He communed with them. They saw him. They conversed with him. Over a long period of time, 40 days, he was with them. Many witnesses saw him. And then finally, of course, he went back to the Father, and they continued to proclaim that he's risen. Sadly, the sign Jesus gave to his nation was not believed by them. In John, the 9th chapter, we find that Jesus, with his disciples, came in contact with a blind man, and Jesus gave sight to that blind man. It was a marvelous miracle, one that could not be disputed. And so we find that the rulers could not dispute that the blind man had been given sight and a miracle had occurred. And they said to the blind man, "You give glory to God. this man is a sinner. And the blind man said, whether he's a sinner or not, he opened my eyes. And they asked him, what do you think about him? He's a prophet. And they responded, we know God spake to Moses, but as far as this man is concerned, we know not whence he is. He had given them a great miracle in proving that he had power to give sight to the blind and to raise from the dead. But they didn't know what that meant. And when Jesus was raised from the dead, they rejected it. But that sign Jesus gave to the Jews is a sign that still exists today. In Paul's letter to the Romans, he wrote, Jesus, born of the seed of David according to the flesh, but declared to be the Son of God with power by the resurrection from the dead. That's his sign to you and to me. His resurrection was documented. It was witnessed. And it's up to me or you to believe it. We thank you for listening. Accept this sign that Jesus gave and be obedient to the instructions that this one, who by his sign proved himself to be the Son of God and has all power in heaven and earth, has commanded you. His command to you, he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. Thank you for listening. In our next lesson, a week, we'll study this question. A man named Nicodemus.